Good morning, and thank you for joining us for this morning's children's reading series. Project Chimps is a 236-acre sanctuary located in the Blue Ridge Mountains, created specifically to help chimpanzees formerly used in medical research. Our mission is to provide lifelong exemplary care to chimpanzees retired from research. Since 2016, we've been transporting chimps from the New Iberia Research Center in Louisiana here to the Blue Ridge Mountains. This is an overhead view of our habitat. We call it the Peachtree habitat. And along our habitat, we have different villas or houses where the chimpanzees live. We have our Cedar Tree Villa, our Dorothy, Joe, and Tilly Villa, Chimps Ahoy Villa, the Harmony Villa, and the McGrath Family Chateau, which is where two families of chimps live. The chimpanzees all live in these large group villas, and here's a little view of their interior space. On the left, we have our vet, Dr. Silver, and she's inside the Cedar Tree Villa interacting with some of the chimpanzees there. And on the right-hand side is one of our facilities experts, Lucas, who's working on some new climbing structures for the chimps inside the chateau. We try to give the chimps all sorts of different healthy foods, from vegetables and fruits to nuts and seeds. They even get some very special chimp chow that has all sorts of good vitamins for them. In addition to lots of yummy foods, the chimps also get daily enrichment. And these are some tasty treats that we give them in a manner in which the chimps have to work at it to get their tasty treat. So on the left is one of our caregivers, Beverly, and she's created this wheel where inside each one of the bottles is a different yummy treat, and the chimps have to find a tool to get to that treat from the other side. On the right are some of the chimps at one of our termite mounts. While there are not termites in there, we put jams and butters and different sweet treats in there that the chimps can then find a tool to get to their tasty treat. We also have a variety of different events and field trips throughout the year where you might have your opportunity to come and meet the chimps. And of course, in today's times, we do have a lot of virtual field trips that we are offering. Gayle has been a high school science teacher and local school administrator and district level curriculum director for the last 40 years. Early in her career, Gayle was introduced to Jane Goodall and her work with chimpanzees, and she quickly became her hero. Gayle was thrilled to learn about Project Chimps when she retired to the North Georgia mountains and has been volunteering at the sanctuary ever since the summer of 2018. Gayle is going to read us Chimp Rescue, True Life Stories by Jess French.
Good morning. Today I'm going to have the opportunity to read you a true story about a young chimpanzee named Chimwa. And I hope that through this story, you're going to come to love Chimwa just as much as I do. Deep in the lush green forests of Cameroon, Central Africa, a baby chimpanzee was cradled in her mama's arms. Chimwa had been watching a group of young chimpanzees play. She wanted to join in, but at just a few months old, she wasn't yet strong enough to leave her mama's side. Here's Chimwa and her mama. From this spot, Chimwa could see the whole group. 4 chimpanzees sat in a row, grooming each other. They often had bits of dirt, plants, or insects in their hair, which needed to be removed. The chimpanzee at the front of the line was Chimwa's sister. She held out her arm, and the next chimpanzee along parted the hair and picked out a small insect with her teeth. The older chimpanzees took turns grooming each other, but baby Chimwa, she was lucky. Her mama groomed her every day to keep her clean and to strengthen their bond. And again, here's Chimwa and her mama. A couple of young chimpanzees were still playing and chasing each other in the top branches of the trees. Sometimes they would collide in the clearing and they'd wrestle in the dirt. The rest of Chimwa's group had wandered to another feeding spot for the day, but they'd be back before dark. Adult chimpanzees mainly eat leaves and fruit, but sometimes they'll eat other animals, from termites and beetle grubs to birds, bush pigs, and even monkeys. They also like to eat nuts and seeds. When the kula tree is in season, Chimwa's family enjoys nothing more than feasting on the delicious nuts, breaking them into kernels and hitting them with stone hammers. You won't get this really close, but right there's a little kula nut that Chimwa's feasting on. It was time for Chimwa's afternoon nap, but she was desperately trying to not close her eyes. She loved to watch the older chimps crack open the nuts, and they would lift the heavy stones high above their heads, and then they'd bring them down on the kula branches. Chimwa still spent most of her time drinking milk from her mother, but occasionally she was allowed to try a kula nut. Look at this. Here's another picture of Chimwa and her mama. A strong old chimpanzee reached over to Chimwa. In his hand was a fresh kula nut. She took it gratefully from her father and she pushed it between her rubbery lips. He was the biggest and the strongest of all the chimpanzees in her group, and the best nutcracker. Every day he would spend hours patrolling the edge of her group's territory and protecting them from danger. With a full belly, Chimwa just couldn't keep her eyes open. Nowhere felt warmer and safer, so she buried her little pink hands into her mother's hair and she drifted off into a deep sleep. Can you see her there, all snuggled in with her mama? She's taking her nap. Piercing noise woke Chimwa up with a start. The chimpanzees in her group were all staring in the direction of the sound. She didn't hear a chimpanzee scream often, and it always meant something bad. See, she's puzzled, she's concerned, she's scared. Chimwa opened her eyes. She was no longer holding her mama's coat. She was alone and she was trapped inside a coarse sack. She made a woo call to her mother. There was no reply. She began to panic and scrambled about. She was trying to escape. A human kicked at the wriggling body and caught Chimwa hard in the stomach. She stopped struggling and she whimpered quietly in pain. The sack smelled strange, and Chimwa was frightened. She didn't know how long she'd been asleep. It was impossible to tell the difference between night and day. She heard a lot of strange sounds, but there was no singing sunbirds or hooting of owls to welcome the day. Chimwa wanted to see her mama, to slip into the nest, to cuddle down for the night. Her mother was gone forever. The strange noise that Chimwa could hear was the sound of a human market. It was mid-afternoon in central Douala. Families were looking at bright piles of fruit and vegetables, and stall holders were shouting the prices of their goods. A group of teenage boys were even playing music from a rusty old van. It was a strange place to illegally sell a baby chimpanzee and the bushmeat from its family. Here's chimpanzee all in the sack. She has no idea where she is. She's just hearing all those weird sounds she's never heard before. It wasn't long before her sack was dragged to another area of the market. Every rock and stone bashed and bruised her body. Finally, she was still again. There were even more new sounds. There were parrots squawking and dogs barking and monkeys chattering. It sure didn't sound like her forest. She was confused. She'd never been away from her mother before, and she had no idea how to survive alone. See how confused she looks? The sack was flung open, and a woman reached in, and she pulled Chimwa out by her neck. Chimwa looked all around with wide, scary eyes. There were rows of stalls and people rushing around everywhere like ants around an anthill. Before she could have a proper look around, she was thrust into the arms of the owner of a restaurant. This was the first time she'd ever seen a human up close. The owner had long hair on her head, and her muscles were small. They were covered with material, and her face was round. Chimwa peered out over the woman's shoulder. She did not like this human world. It was loud and bright and foreign. She wondered what had happened to the rest of her family. Perhaps they were still in the forest with its lush green leaves and delicious seeds. Chimwa was hungry. Her throat was scratchy. It was dry. She had not been given any food or water. Normally, she ate continuously throughout the day. Her stomach grumbled, but those humans, they didn't seem to notice. The restaurant owner passed some money to the people at the pet stall, and Chimwa was pushed once again into the sack. A few stalls down, there were more illegal products. There were rhino horns, decorative ivory pendants, leopard skins, even dead turtles. Chimwa was taken away from the market and carried to a restaurant. The smells were different here. There were not as many people, but there were lots of buildings. A man approached. He held Chimwa's arm tightly to her sides while the woman fixed a rope around her neck. When the rope was tight, they placed her in a cage. The bars were made of rusty steel, and the floor was hard, gray concrete. There was barely enough room for Chimwa to stand. She sat down. She started to pull on the rope around her neck. The man sat a few yards away and he was watching her. When he realized that she was trying to take off the rope, he shouted at her. She tried biting the rope, but this made him so angry that he threw a rock at her. Chimwa whimpered. Here's poor Chimwa. There were no trees to protect her from the baking midday sun, and her bones began to ache. Whenever the sun was too hot before, her mama would climb down from the trees and they would sit in the shade. But in her new cage, there was no escape. Feeling frightened and weak from hunger and thirst, Chimwa fell asleep. Many hours later, she woke to a human shaking her. It was the man who had thrown the rock. Everything was dark now. Nighttime in the forest was for sleeping and snuggling in the safety of her mama's hair. In her tree nest, she felt safe from the nighttime predators like hyenas. Though she was less likely to be bitten by insects, and she was a whole lot warmer than she would be on the ground. Here in the human world, the noises were louder at night. There seemed to be people walking around everywhere. The man who threw the rock pulled her from the cage and lifted her in his arms. They strode along the busy road. People stopped. He would pass Chimwa to them. Here's Chimwa in her cage. She would cling tightly around the humans' necks for fear of being dropped to the floor. The people misunderstood this. They thought it was an act of love, not fear. And sometimes they would hug her, they would stroke her head, and sometimes they would even poke or tickle at her. The women would often squeal in her ear. They'd stare straight into her eyes. Her eyes were wide with fear. And there was nearly always a flash of bright light. Of course, the flashes of light came from the cameras. Crowds of tourists would take her picture every night. The man who threw the rock earned a lot of money from charging people for photos with the baby chimpanzee. It's illegal to use a baby chimpanzee as a photo prop. The rules were rarely enforced. They would often walk to areas where the streets thronged with people and the air was thick with smoke and music and singing. The people seemed loud and aggressive. Their breath had a strange, sour smell, and their eyes were red and glazed. At the end of the night, she'd be thrown back in her cage and abandoned into the following evening. She tried to sleep, but the noises, they were so loud, and her eyes were so bright from the flashes of light that she often stayed awake for hours. The sun rose early and beat down relentlessly, and all day, laying in the baking sun, often with no food or water. Sometimes the woman from the restaurant would throw her some rice. She didn't like the taste of it, but she was hungry, so she ate it. She felt constantly thirsty. And when it rained, which it rarely did, she would try to catch water in her hands to drink. Her thick hair would hold the water for hours, and for the rest of the day, she would gratefully suck water from it. Here's our Chimwa. Poor Chimwa. Her routine did not vary very much. Every night they would walk the streets and humans would flash bright lights at her. Every day she would try to sleep in the baking sun and grow thin and more dehydrated. And after a while, she could barely lift her head. Slowly, Chimwa was forgetting how to be a chimpanzee. The first few lives of a chimpanzee's life are crucial. It's the time they learn to interact with other chimpanzees and to live in the forest. The sounds and the smells of her forest home were slowly fading into a distant memory, being replaced by the stench and the noise of the busy human town. Here's our Chimwa. Look at those sad, soulful eyes. After months of this, she believed it'd be this way forever. And so she stopped paying attention to the humans that came to take pictures. All day she would rock back and forth in her cage and chattered her teeth. Worst of all, she had a constant headache that wouldn't go away, and her tummy seemed to always ache. The regular customers of the restaurant became so used to seeing the chimpanzee that they barely glanced in her direction anymore. She didn't recognize their faces, so she didn't notice when an unknown, kind-faced customer came to visit. The customer observed Chimwa rocking in her cage and chattering her teeth, and she watched as Chimwa cowered from the scorching sun. She was angry that such a beautiful and gentle creature was being kept in a cruel steel cage. She knew something had to be done, and she was desperate to help. Luckily, the customer knew of a famous sanctuary near Douala. It was called Limbe Wildlife Center, and they do amazing work for rescued primates. Hoping for a better future for Chimwa, she called them to ask if they could help. Again, here's our Chimwa. Thank goodness this visitor discovered her. Just know that rescuing a chimpanzee is not a simple job. It needs to be carefully planned, and there's lots of paperwork to fill out. There was a man named John Pierre, and he set up a whole team of wildlife officials to prepare everything. And this included a rescue car, a mission order, official document that would allow the officials to seize Chimwa. And so on January 17, 2014, John Pierre arrived at the restaurant with some staff from Limbe Wildlife Center and a group of wildlife officials. It'd been a long drive, but there was a buzz of energy in the air. Everybody knew they just had one chance to get this rescue right. There she is. When John Pierre returned with a ripe bunch of bananas, Chimwa walked on a rope to the front of the restaurant. She reached hungrily for a banana, and she snatched it from John Pierre's hand. At that moment, the wildlife officials rushed over. They began to question. Chimwa was confused by all the commotion. She knew something unusual was happening, but she didn't realize that her life was about to change. I want you to look at this box they're going to put her in, this soft green box. So they slipped into the restaurant and they rescued her. The staff carried Chimwa away from the restaurant and over to their car. They gave her water to drink, and they placed her in that soft, clean box we saw. The people were gentle. They spoke in quiet tones. Chimwa was driven to the Limbe Wildlife Center. Limbe cares for 15 different species of primates, including baboons, gorillas, and chimpanzees. And although Chimwa was now out of immediate danger, this was only her first step on the road to recovery. After 3 months in quarantine, Chimwa looked much better. She was healthy and strong, and her eyes were bright and full of life. She no longer sat quietly in the back of her cage, but at the front, calling excitedly for her food when it arrived. Chimwa passed her quarantine, showing no signs of infectious disease, and she was ready to move on to the next stage. On the last morning of her quarantine, Chimwa climbed into the arms of the human who had brought her food. She was now much less fearful of people, and she seemed to enjoy spending time with the center's staff. Chimwa had never been out of quarantine area before, but today they walked outside into the bright sunshine. She looked around nervously. Here she is. She's finally getting to go outside. As she approached the trees, she began to notice a strange range of familiar sights and sounds. She looked up. The leaves of the trees cast a welcome shadow over her face. They were the same trees her mother had climbed with her every evening to build a sleeping nest and to snuggle down for the night. She sniffed the air. It smelled warm and earthy. A bird sang loudly overhead. She looked around at the trees and the plants, trying to remember which trees were good to eat, which ones produced a bitter fruit, and which ones gave the best shade. It took a while before she spotted 3 hunched figures sitting in a patch of shade. She stared in stunned silence. She would recognize these hairy black features anywhere. They were other chimpanzees. The human placed Chimwa on the ground and walked away, leaving her alone with the other chimpanzees. After such a long time, Chimwa could not remember how to act around them. She hid in a corner, watching quietly. The other chimpanzees played together, rolling around on the ground, swinging on the climbing frame in their enclosure. And sometimes they would run close to Chimwa, and she would shuffle back out of the way. All of the chimpanzees in the enclosure were also rescued orphans. They played together effortlessly, and they looked so much like the wild chimpanzees in the forest that it was hard to believe that they had once forgotten how to act like chimpanzees too. After a morning of play, the humans brought the chimpanzees some kola nuts. They immediately set about cracking the nuts with stones and to get at the fruit inside, just as her family had once done in the forest. The newest chimpanzee to Chimwa was named Billy. She looked over and cracked her stone onto a nut. Billy had been rescued in an even worse state than Chimwa. She was locked away and starved, with only a puppy for company. When Billy arrived at Limbe, she had a broken jaw and a viral infection. Here's Billy and Chimwa. Notice Billy's teeth. Now Billy was thriving. She had learned how to act around the chimpanzees, and although she was frightened of the male chimps, she loved to make friends with the other young females. It would take some time for Chimwa to trust the other chimpanzees. Almost all of her childhood so far had been spent isolated and miserable, and she hadn't seen any of her own species in nearly a year. Until Chimwa was integrated with the group, she would only spend the daylight hours in the nursery, and at night she'd go back to quarantine where she felt safe. As time passed, Chimwa grew more and more excited about going to the nursery. She would watch the other chimpanzees intently. She'd listen to their calls, and she'd imitate their faces. Every day, Billy would come over just a little bit closer and try to interact with Chimwa. One evening, as the sun was settling in the late summer sky, Chimwa allowed Billy to approach her. Shaking with nerves, she turned her back to Billy and gently Billy began to search her hair for flies and other insects. The feeling of being groomed was so familiar, it was as if she was in the forest again with her family. And whenever Billy found a bug in her hair, she would squash it with her nimble fingers and then grab it with her rubbery lips, grunting contentedly. Chimwa closed her eyes, enjoying the cool of the shade, the sunbird singing above her. She was beginning to remember. In the dry season, Cameroon is scorched by soaring temperatures. The winds swirl the desert dust across the sky and cover it in a crimson haze. Luckily for the animals at the Limbe Wildlife Center, the staff keeps their enclosure pools topped with fresh water. If you visit Limbe in the dry season, that is where you'll find Chimwa. She'll be splashing about in the nursery pool, and she'll be jumping in and out with gusto. Look at this. Check this out. She loves playing in the water, especially in the afternoon when the baking sun is at its fiercest. And she now lives at the nursery full time. Chimwa will never be able to be released into the wild. Deforestation is depleting her natural habitat at such an alarming rate that it's very difficult to find space for rescued chimps in the wild. Look at her. Oh, yeah. Not only that, but Chimwa has missed the crucial early years of learning where she should have received from her mother and her close family. She would not know how to survive in the wild, how to hide from the predators, how to build a nest at night, or what food to eat. The liver disease that Chimwa contracted as a result of her conditions in captivity may also need lifelong veterinary care. But you know what? Chimwa has a new family now, and she'll live out her years with friends, food, and all the medical attention that she needs. Thanks to the efforts of the last great ape organization, the Limbe Wildlife Center, and the Born Free Foundation, and they provide for their amazing work in Chimwa's care. At last, Chimwa is safe. Thank you so much. I hope you enjoyed this story as much as me, and that you'll want to read and learn more about Chimwa. Have a good day.
Thank you so much, Gayle, for sharing that story about Chimwa with us. Here at Project Chimps, it costs approximately $22,000 a year to take care of each one of our chimps and to provide them everything that they need, from their food, housing, medical care, and enrichment activities. And we sure hope that you enjoyed this program. It costs $7 a day to feed one chimp and $3 a day to provide enrichment for one chimp. So for just $10, you can provide all meals and enrichment activities for one chimp for one day. Consider an annual chimp sponsorship as a gift for $250 or monthly at $23. You can check out our website to learn more about how you can visit the chimps at one of our upcoming events, field trips, or other adventures. And if you haven't done so already, please check out our website at www.projectchimps.org. There's a page where you can meet the chimps and see all their pictures and get an idea of some of the other fun offerings that we have. If you've missed some of our other children's reading series, you can find them on our Facebook page, and you can also get on our YouTube page to find some of the other readings that we've done. And we're so glad that you joined us for this, and we hope that you join us for another future program. Have a great day.